Hello there, kia ora. Do you know just how much access lobbyists have to our politicians, parliamentarians, people who put policy into place, and just how much worse it's about to get? The answer is probably no, because it's actually a really shady feeling organizational group that we don't get to see or hear much of, and when we do, it's never in a nice positive light, usually. You see, lobbyists have a pretty good run of it in this country. We have some of the least regulated rules around lobbying and our politicians. And every couple of years, there's a little bit of noise in the press about how shady this all feels, and the government at the time does something like release a list or cut back on the number of people who have after hours access to parliament to make people feel like we're tightening down on what's going on. And this isn't a problem that's specifically unique to left or right leaning parties. It is a problem that seems to affect no matter who's in power. And it's about to get worse. You see, the National Party has decided that they're no longer going to publish a list that was started under the last government that let people know who had after hours access to Parliament. But they are adding to that list with about quote unquote about four people, weird way of phrasing it, being added. On top of that, well, because there are no rules between when somebody can work in Parliament, when someone can be a lobbyist, there's a lot of questions about who has connections where and what's going on. There are some really, well, it feels kind of transparent ones, like the smoking groups, for example. Chris Bishop, before he became an MP, right up until the day before he became an MP, was a lobbyist for a tobacco company. And we're starting to see policies come into place that feel like they were written by tobacco lobbyists. Chris Hipkins, when he was Prime Minister, his Chief of Staff was a former lobbyist up until the day he took over as Chief of Staff. He worked for the container industry, and within days of Hipkins becoming Prime Minister, they got rid of the recycling container scheme that had been planned. It feels like there are links directly between what some lobbyists want and what our government does. And not knowing what those access points are becomes really shady feeling for voters out there. But it gets even more concerning because there are some links that we might not necessarily be aware of. There are some links that you could claim for Nicola Willis, for example, whose father was a lawyer in the oil and gas mining industry for 45 years, and now they're looking at reopening that as a policy point for this government. That might not necessarily be counted as lobbying because it's a family link. Then you've got issues around ACT and their connections with the Atlas network. By not letting us know who it is that is having access to our politicians, we don't know exactly how much influence they are trying to put onto our politicians, if any at all. But those links still exist, which makes everything again feel kind of shady. And here's the real crux of the issue: they're not going to change anything no matter the outcry because, well, lobbyists and politicians have kind of a symbiotic relationship. Not necessarily a good kind of symbiotic relationship like pilot fish and sharks, more like the bad kind like gold and humans in the Stargate universe. It's really, really problematic. And while there were rules that were kind of introduced, those rules were supposed to be regulated by the lobbying industry, which means they have no incentive to really follow them, especially when there was no repercussions if they didn't. And the industry themselves turned around and said, that's not really the way that you want to do this. There should be some repercussions from government if we don't follow the rules that we're supposed to follow. So we have these really dodgy connections from what feel like really shady organizations that are going out of their way to have access to our parliamentarians. And lobby groups can be pretty much anything from the Atlas Foundation through to Forest and Bird. But not knowing who has access and has the ear of our politicians, that does not lead to an open and honest democracy.